Hello, everyone. I'm your host, Joel Bryce, and welcome to another episode of Delta Waterfowl's The Voice of the Duck Hunter podcast. As hunters, we all rely on trained wildlife professionals to make sound decisions when it comes to structuring hunting seasons, bag limits, and overall population management. In turn, biologists routinely rely on hunters to voluntarily provide personal and accurate information in terms of hunting activity and success in the field. On today's episode, we talk harvest surveys, in particular, the Migratory Bird Harvest Information Program, or HIP, as it's most commonly referred to. We discuss the purpose of HIP and why it's important that migratory bird hunters participate in this program each and every year. To help discuss the ins and outs of HIP, I'm joined by Brad Bortner from the Wildlife Management Institute. Hello, Brad.
Howdy, Joel. How are you doing?
I'm great. So for those who are listening to this podcast, Brad and I are both up on the screen, so I just brought him in here so the world can see. So again, as I say often, you are officially on record as being on the podcast.
I'll look for my my podcast T-shirt in the mail.
I'll have to develop one and get it to you right away. Hey, tell us real quick there, this background for those that are watching. I see what looks like Brant in the background.
They're Brant decoys floating out on the Pacific, and I have a kind of a historic Brant rig, a hand-carved Brant rig that I've accumulated over the years from various older Brant hunters who are getting out of the business, and it includes one hand-carved one from a guy by the name of Chris Nicolai, who you might know.
Yeah, we might know him. Yep, he might be just down the hallway here at the office, so that's pretty great. So Brad, I want tradition here. I want everybody to get to understand who you are. Why did I bring on Brad? Who is he? So Brad Bortner, give us a background, and feel free to start where you're from. We're all from somewhere. Go through your professional career and what lands you in this capacity today.
Well, I like to tell people when they ask me where I'm from, I'm kind of from a Johnny Cash song. I've been everywhere, man. My father was career Navy, and so I've lived all over the United States and abroad. Everything from New England to Florida to California to out in the middle of the Pacific at Guam, and then back to Maryland. And I spent my high school years in Maryland on the Chesapeake Bay, out of Annapolis, and that's where I developed my love for waterfowl and being out in the marsh on the Chesapeake. So grew up there, went off to college, got a degree in wildlife biology from the University of Vermont. While I was doing that, I picked up a forestry bachelor's degree also. And at the end of my first senior year, my major advisor said, you like waterfowl, you need to go to this place up in Manitoba called Delta Waterfowl Research Station. And 1980, I went up there, and there was a guy I met pretty much the first day. His name was Frank Royer. He was a graduate student working on his PhD, and spent some time with Frank. And he had a technician by the name of Jonathan Scarth, another icon in the Delta world. And I got pretty friendly with a female graduate student up there, and I married her. So I went on to study whistling swans, or tundra swans as it's called now. And when I was finishing up my master's, I got offered a chance for a PhD or a chance to join the federal government. And I went and became a migratory bird biologist for the federal government. And I worked 3 years as the woodcock specialist for the Office of Migratory Bird Management. And then took a couple promotions. And then in 92, I ended up transferring out to Portland, Oregon as the chief of migratory birds for the Pacific region. And I worked in all the migratory bird issues from California to Oregon, Washington, Idaho, Nevada, and the Pacific Islands. And I did that for 19 years in all sorts of different activities, from disease control to population management to habitat management and developing partnerships. And then in 2011, we had a vacancy in Washington, D.C., and I went into Washington, D.C. He was the national chief of migratory bird management. And I did that for 6 years and retired at the end of 2017. And so that's pretty much my professional career. I'm retired now and spend most of my time with a shotgun in my hand, either chasing waterfowl or upland birds. But a couple of years ago, Wildlife Management Institute asked me to if I'd be interested in picking up a project for them on the Harvest Information Program. And since I was involved in the formation of the Harvest Information Program 25, 30 years ago, I thought it was something that would be fun to do in retirement, because I'm passionate about the data used for setting migratory bird hunting regulations.
That is impressive. So, I mean, I just kind of want to state the obvious here. We have folks, we have the expert, on this podcast when it comes to at least migratory bird surveys, when it comes to hunter participation. Brad, the importance of hunter surveys, right? Would you have been able to do your job without a good survey system, without a good methodology out there?
No, actually, like I said, that's how I got involved in what has become hip. Is when I was the woodcock specialist back in the 80s, I was trying to manage woodcock populations, and we had a little bit of banding information. We had what's called the singing ground survey, which gives us an index to the breeding population, but we had limited information on harvest and how many woodcock hunters there are. And when I started talking to folks about managing other non-waterfowl migratory birds, we realized very quickly that our data sets are very limited. And we really needed better information so we could set the appropriate regulations. And at that point in time, we were facing a lot of scrutiny about hunting regulations in general, and proving up our data sets and being able to show the courts and everything else what data we were using for management was vital for continuation of this activity that we so much enjoy, migratory bird hunting.
It's as trained wildlife professionals, when we go through college, we're taught about surveys, we're taught about estimating populations or censusing with some types of species. But with the complexity of migratory birds, the fact that they go into the far reaches of northern reaches of North America, and then some of these species end up into Central and South America, it's impossible for us as managers to census migratory birds, get an absolute count, get an absolute cause effect measurement of what's going on. And so it's in the introduction I said, it's as hunters, we rely on trained wildlife professionals to manage these populations. And I would say that at least in the case of migratory birds, they lean heavily on the hunter as well. Is that a fair statement?
Oh yeah, the hunter and the information that they provide is can't be overstated. The importance of the information that we get from hunters, whether it's returns or bans or participation in harvest surveys, all of that is critical for our management of migratory birds. And you just have to walk down the hall and talk to Chris Nicolai and talk about Lincoln Peterson estimates and how important the harvest estimate is for coming up with a population estimate for those species that we can't count any other way. And that's why having good, valid, precise harvest information is so important, especially for the non-waterfowl species.
Right. So I think as an intro to HIP, let's start with an experience that every migratory bird hunter should be having, right? And we'll start with the should be having. So just last month, I purchased my hunting license through the North Dakota Game and Fish, online platform. They asked me the question, do you plan to hunt doves, ducks, geese, snipe, woodcock, crane, swan, or coots in the upcoming year? I answered yes. And so that populated a whole list of questions. Now, this is a requirement, right, Brad? to register to complete this survey process, this is a requirement.
It is a requirement. The backstory on HIP is it's a state-federal partnership, and we were looking for information on managing migratory game birds, and we all came to the realization that we needed something. And the states have the purview of collecting names and addresses and everything else. So they wanted to be the front end of what is now called HIP, asking you those questions, getting your name and address, and then they turn that information over to the Fish and Wildlife Service, and the Fish and Wildlife Service conducts the harvest surveys subsequent to that. But in order to make sure that it's uniform and across everything else, it actually was made a federal requirement. So every migratory bird hunter is required to get a HIP certification in every state that they hunt.
So I guess there's two things there. One, if you're out migratory bird hunting and you're checked by a law enforcement officer, you need to have a HIP number recorded with your license.
Correct.
That's the legal requirement. Okay. So I guess the other aspect, now that's the legal requirement. So again, there were a few more questions. Like I'm looking at one right now. So it was, I was asked questions based on ducks, geese, doves, coots or snipe, and light geese. Well, the light geese, maybe it's a different situation there, but with ducks, the options were did not hunt ducks last season, hunted ducks, but did not bag any, harvested 1 to 10, or harvested 11 or more. Now there's a couple other surveys that you'll talk about that come as a result of this, but the legal requirement ends here. Is that right? And the others
that's correct.
Voluntary. So
yes,
we can regulate this aspect of it, but not the rest. So
well, yeah, regulate is a strong term, and we're hoping, and what I'm hoping to do today is to explain to hunters why it's important for them to participate, and realize that it's in their best interest in for setting appropriate hunting regulations and providing hunting opportunity to participate, want to participate in the survey. Those questions that you're asking are not the survey. Those are questions that the Fish and Wildlife Service, the states and the Fish and Wildlife Service uses to, and I don't want to get too deep into statistical terminology, but to group hunters who are alike into different pots so they can be sampled to come up with an accurate and precise measure of their activity and how successful they are.
Okay. So the other one, so there's 3 surveys that I see. So there's HIP, and I call it the survey because you're asked a series of questions as you're buying your license. But then there's the hunter survey or the diary survey, and then there's the parts collection survey or submitting wings. I want to back up a step there. So if you buy a federal duck stamp, that's good in all 50 states, but your HIP registration must be completed in each of the states, right?
That's correct.
So if you're from Washington State and you drive down to California to hunt, you have 2 HIP registrations, right?
I do. In a report I answer those questions relative to my activity in that state the previous year. But I think we would all agree that if we had a single federal harvest survey, HIP registration, it would be cleaner and you'd only have to get it once. But as I said, it's the states are the experts in collecting name and address information, and they have the responsibility of the purview of licensing hunters on a statewide basis. So we made the decision years ago that instead of having this as a federal survey or a federal entry into the survey, there would be a states, and it really truly is a state federal partnership. States collect the names and addresses and the answers to those questions, and then turn it over to the Fish and Wildlife Service. Fish and Wildlife Service does, as you said, the mail questionnaire survey, and then for the various species, the parts collection survey, compiles the information and shares that back out with the flyways, and the flyways and the Fish and Wildlife Service use that to develop regulatory proposals and harvest strategies.
Okay. So I'm going to keep bouncing back out to me, the duck hunter.
Mhm.
So I've registered for HIP. I understand that, the information that I produced through that initial questionnaire is used. Perhaps I'll be one of the hunters selected for, the diary survey, or perhaps I'll be one of them selected for the parts collection survey. But if I'm not, if you just have the information from that entry level questionnaire, I have my HIP number. What is generated from that? What's the value of that information in and of itself?
Well, that information, one goes in and the states and the Fish and Wildlife Service know the universe of migratory bird hunters. You're involved with R3 efforts and everything else. So here is a way that we can identify, different communities within the R3 world, and start developing management programs to reactivate, to renew, and all the other aspects of R3. So we know how avid they are, and who we're at, and who we're gaining and who we're losing. So you can think of all kinds of ancillary uses for that information. But for right now, it's just the HIP is focused on collecting the names and addresses and those answers to develop the sampling frame. And then if you think about those questions, are the hunters telling us how successful they were and basically how avid they were. And those answers go into little buckets, and it's called a stratified random sample. And you go in and you sample within those things. And so of all the hunters that are reporting that they shoot 30 or more ducks a year, we can sample at a rate and get a precise estimate on that versus the ones that are less successful and less avid. And it adds to coming up with a precise survey, but also an efficient survey. If you think about trying to find who are the rail hunters in the United States, if you didn't have that sort of sample, you would be sending out thousands and thousands and thousands of questionnaires to people who would say, I've never shot a rail in my life, never seen a rail, don't know what a rail is. Why are you asking me these questions? And you can imagine that, from a statistical standpoint, the precision of your estimate, would be plus or minus 1,000%. And so in order to be much more efficient and much more precise, we need to stratify the hunters into those groups.
Okay. So through the HIP registration process, you can end up with a count or an index of how many hunters are out there in a given year. I think it's important to point out, at this moment right here where that entry survey takes place, I do think that there's a subset of hunters out there that I don't know if it's a law enforcement concern, but there's a level of distrust here. And so I hear at times that a particular hunter might be shy about, if they shot 50 ducks, they might be shy about, selecting the highest harvest level, for concern of that, I don't know if that makes them a target for law enforcement. I'm just being the conspiracy theorist. So I just want to, at this moment in time, other than did you register for HIP or did you not, there are zero legal ramifications or spin-offs of this program.
That's correct. The answer to the question, is purely to put you and the other hunters who are that active or that successful into the same sampling bucket. And there is no legal ramifications if your name is not going on some special list for law enforcement to come check your freezer if you indicate that you hunt and kill more than 30 ducks a year. Those are conspiracy theories. I've heard them all before in the past. They're not accurate, and the answers to those questions also are not the survey. I hear that one also a lot too, is, well, if I put down 0, they're going to think that we're less successful, therefore we're going to have more liberal seasons. It doesn't work that way. And that's why I think it's important that hunters understand the survey, understand why their participation is important, and they're truthful honest answers are important for getting good estimates, but also it feeds directly into the harvest management strategies. If you're a mourning dove hunter, if you're a pintail shooter, those harvest estimates feed directly into the models that and the harvest strategies for those species. And so if you have imprecise information in migratory bird management, what happens is the regulations end up being more conservative instead of more liberal, because of the risk tolerance of the agencies.
So in short, if you're falsifying information or you're not providing accurate information, if you're misleading through any of the surveys that we're going to talk about, you're hurting yourself as a hunter. Garbage in, garbage out. Quality information in, a quality product in return. So, if Brad and I do our job today, when the listener goes out and buys their hunting license for the year and they say yes, please say yes. If you're going to hunt migratory birds, say yes, and then truly answer, the categorical questions. And if you are selected for any of the resulting surveys, take part. Keep a good diary, collect all of your wings. So let's move on from there. Anything more you wanted to say about the entry point, Brad, or is this a comfort?
Well, I just want folks to realize, your listeners to realize that they're a critical component of migratory bird management, and we don't have these surveys in here for any other reason except we want to provide hunting opportunity and that the regulations are appropriate. And as you said, it's in the hunter's best interest to participate as best they can. And, if they've got questions, come to the management professionals and we'll try to answer those. If they've got concerns, we can try to alleviate those concerns. But, going around and, as you said, and spreading the urban rumors about what the information is used for or how it's going to, bite you in the butt. Most of that's just, somebody doesn't have enough of, understanding of the system and, jumping to conclusions.
So be excited if you're selected. One of the ladies in our office, she was selected for jury duty. And the night before, she's the only one I've ever heard say that. She goes, I hope I get to go tomorrow. I've always wanted to do that. So hopefully, if you're selected through any of these surveys, you go, great. I hoped it came my way. I'm giddy to be a part of it. So, okay. So basically hip number, now you're able to stratify your sample. And so now a hunter might be selected for either the diary survey or the parts collection survey. We'll talk about each one of those. Let me ask you, Brad, can you be selected for both?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah. You can be. Typically, you're not selected for the parts collection survey unless you've agreed to participate in the mail questionnaire survey. So 1 year you get the request to keep the diary, and if you do that, and the next year you have an opportunity to, you may have the opportunity to participate in the parts collection survey. Okay. Typically, they don't send out the parts collection survey on a random basis, but they do sometimes if they don't have enough participants from a single state.
Okay, so let's look at the migratory bird hunter survey. You heard me call them diary surveys, just kind of descriptive of what you're doing. Can you describe what that one is? So if you're selected, what does it look like? And then what's the purpose of that aspect?
The diary survey basically asks you the date that you went hunting, the county in the state, and how many ducks and geese, in the case of waterfowl, that you harvested. And you keep a record for every day of the season, and what that allows the Fish and Wildlife Service to do is get an idea of hunter activity, how much you're getting out. Again, these are all sampling efforts. They're surveys. They're not a complete census where we're not trying to touch base with every single hunter out there. Just a sample of them, and from that, they draw conclusions about 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 all hunters. It'd be very difficult to encounter or to survey every hunter and get a complete census of their activity and everything else. Is not necessary either.
Right. It's been a while. It's been a while since I was selected for a diary survey. I don't recall. So it's a genuine question. Does a hunter attempt to break down or break out species, or it's just I harvest this many ducks, this many geese, or nothing, right?
That's correct.
Okay.
It's not species. The species composition of the harvest, along with age and sex, is determined from the parts collection survey.
Okay. So through the diary survey, you come up with a predicted harvest, like duck hunters, goose hunters harvested this many ducks and geese this year, but you don't know the species. So now, again, you just kind of set it up here. Now we flip over into the parts collection survey, and there you get a bunch of big yellow envelopes, as I recall, for each one of the ducks you harvest or geese you harvest, you cut off a wing, stick it in the bag, and periodically mail them in, right?
That's correct. The geese, you send in the tail feathers, and the ducks and brant, you send in a wing.
Got it. And the brant, why the brant wing and not the tail feathers?
Because you can't tell a brant from a goose by looking at the tail feathers, basically. But I don't want to go too far down into the weeds of biology but just talk about the general mechanisms. But yeah, brant, you submit a wing also.
That was a leading question. I was leading you, Brad, but I think that's the part. So I think that's the number one question that people have, or they ask themselves, if I send you a wing or if I send you tail feathers, you can really tell what species it is, what sex it is, and how old it is. And the answer to that is
I'll send you some links to Fish and Wildlife Service web pages that have Paul Padding explaining how to age and sex duck wings, and show you some examples, and the background Fish and Wildlife Service of information about the harvest survey program and how we go about doing all of that, if people want to take a deep dive into how that is actually done. But yeah, there's also a link to a book that was done by Sam Carney years ago with color pictures of duck wings by species, and you can determine not only age but also sex. So you can tell a female gadwall, an adult female gadwall, from a juvenile female gadwall, or the prototypical brown duck, immature hen widgeon, by looking at the feather characteristics. And if you spend enough time doing this, you become an expert, and you can sort out the age and sex of all the ducks that are harvested out there.
I remember in college, the Wildlife Techniques 101 or 150 or whatever it was. I mean, all of the duck wings. And I come from a long line of waterfowl hunters, and so I thought that I knew, the whole duck. I could get them all. But when it came down to the wing, holy cow, it is a skill, and I do think it's an overlooked skill. Without the ability of biologists to identify all those, what species, what sex, what age from the wing alone, this critical piece of information would be missing. So it's pretty incredible. So hunters selected, we ask, the community asks the hunter to submit the wing or the tail feather in terms of a goose, not named a brant. Where do they go? What's done with those? And then the golly gee whiz trivia. How many wings are submitted on a given year, Brad? Any idea? Any estimate there?
Yeah. I think they generally try to look at about 100,000 parts across all four flyways. Don't quote me on the exact number, but they have a minimum sample size that they try to, this your question earlier about can you participate in both? They have a minimum sample size that they try to get in each flyway, but all of those envelopes go to facilities that receive that mail during the hunting season, and immediately goes into freezers, and they're basically some technical folks at each of those stations that start sorting those out, saying, okay, this is a mallard wing, and puts all the mallard wings in one area, and they sort them out by species in the freezers. And then in February of every year, in each of the 4 flyways, all of the waterfowl biologists from the states and from NGOs and from the federal government get together in what we call a wing bee, kind of coming off the old sewing bee, name, but get around and spend a week going through all of the wings and tail feathers that are submitted in that for the waterfowl world in that flyway. The same happens with mourning doves and woodcock also. And so there are folks that go through all those wings, looks at each one and makes a determination of what species it is, how old it was, and whether it was a male or a female.
So then now, as I think is the appropriate time to kind of marry or zip the 2 surveys together. The diary survey said how many ducks were harvested, period. Mm-hmm. An estimate of how many predicted harvest. Then you take the parts collection survey and say, okay, 25% of our wings were pintail. Is it literally that? Then 25% predicted harvest?
Yeah, without getting into all the math and everything else. Yeah, literally that's basically how it comes. You come up with marrying them together, coming up with an estimate of how many of each species, age and sex was harvested in each of the states, and it's compiled all the way up to the flyway level, and then up to the national level.
Okay, so you could basically, now what you're left with at the end of that surveying season, you end up with an estimated harvest by species, and I guess sex as well. But there's also that juvenile or adult, mm-hmm. meaning was it hatched that prior breeding season, or it just becomes an adult. It could be 7 years old. It's either an adult or it's sub 1 year.
Yeah. So you do get an index of productivity, how productive ducks were this past year. You also can use that information for what's called assessing the differential vulnerability between adult birds and juvenile birds. We all know that juvenile birds decoy easier and that sort of thing. So you can start using that to correct your banding, or using banding information to correct your differential vulnerabilities. So there's a lot of uses for that information. And then once they're finished with all the wings, there are folks that collect wings for museums, for training purposes at universities. You're talking about your ornithology class or your wildlife techniques class. Some of them go off to train other biologists and law enforcement officers. And then other folks in university grad students collect them to look at genetic or chemical composition, and everything from looking at stable isotopes to genetic, looking at genetic population indicators. So lots of use for those parts. It's a very valuable service that the hunters provide. Very valuable information that the hunters provide to the waterfowl management community.
Jeez, it's amazing. So let's go further down the funnel. We're not quite out the end of the funnel yet, but let's jam down a little bit farther. So you have an estimate of total number of hunters. You have an estimate of total harvest, broken down by species, sex, and age. What do you do with all that? Now, how does that turn into, where does that feed the overall harvest management regulating setting enterprise?
Well, as I said, for a number of species, that information is used directly, feeds the model set that comes up with their regulations. In the past 25 years or so, the Fish and Wildlife Service, working with the states, have developed regulatory packages that say, if we hit certain biological criteria, how many ponds, how many ducks, that sort of thing, this age ratio in the harvest, this is what the appropriate regulations is going to be. And so that is a data stream that depends on the species, but it feeds directly into the management decision making, and also and helps inform the strategies that trigger various regulations.
Okay. How did so again, if we haven't shined the proper light on the importance of this survey and everyone participating willingly, voluntarily, we haven't done our job. I do have to ask the question, how, with all of this information and how critical it is, how did the government manage without HIP? So prior to 1999, what types of data were secured?
Well, prior to 1999, the Fish and Wildlife Service piggybacked on the duck stamp sales, the requirement that every waterfowl hunter purchase a duck stamp, and they distributed postcards soliciting participation in the harvest survey for waterfowl on duck stamp sales. With changes in post offices not carrying duck stamps, with not wanting to distribute the postcards, but a number of other things, that system was getting weak, and with the realization that we had no source of information for the other webless migratory birds on harvest and hunter numbers, they were combined into HIP. There was some information on woodcock harvest or mourning dove harvest, or cranes were usually regulated under a special permit. So we had some information, but we didn't have the depth of the information that we have now, which is why the management community said, yes, we need a system, and what we now call HIP for. And HIP's the front end. That's the state's responsibility. The Fish and Wildlife Service does the harvest surveys, and it all feeds the management system at the flyway level.
Okay, so data secured prior to 1999, and then 1999 or later, are they comparable? Do they talk to each other, or is that an interruption in the data stream?
There is an interruption in the database for waterfowl. There, like I said, there isn't much for the webless species prior to 99. But there have been some attempts to mathematically make the two estimates join up and be on but they are to some extent apples and oranges. The sampling frames are completely different, and without sounding like a real egghead and getting into a lot of math and everything else, I'll just say that there have been efforts. There are some comparability, but you have to understand the assumptions that you're making, and that they aren't exactly comparable.
Okay, awesome. You've provided so much information for Delta's listeners, and I think everyone's going to be excited to participate. But now I want to make sure that, Brad, I know that you're working, on a retirement job with the Wildlife Management Institute, and you have some objectives. One is this, right? Just say, hey, everybody, this is really important. Please help out. What are some of your other goals, working with WMI right now? And maybe I'll narrow it down just a little bit farther for you, is that HIP, I'll call it performance. So you have all of these data. Are there other improvements you want to make? Are these reliable estimates that you generate?
Well, you're exactly right. One of my goals is to educate hunters about HIP. Also, frankly, folks from agencies, folks, licensed vendors, and actually some of the companies that have developed the software for selling hunting licenses. There's continual turnover in all of those communities. Like I said before, you're very involved in hunter recruitment, and you probably know better than I what the churn rate is, what the and how many of the hunters that we have now go back to prior to 1999. And so we're finding that there's a continual need to educate folks about HIP and about the harvest surveys and why it's important. So that's one of my tasks. My other task is working with states and identifying what the weaknesses are in their licensing procedures that are adding to imprecision in the estimates and in HIP. And in some cases, we found examples where the license vendor at a sporting goods store has a line of 20 people behind them, trying to buy a hunting license, and they don't want to be bothered to ask the HIP questions. And the license vendor will just hit 0, or didn't hunt last year. And you may have harvested, a couple hundred ducks last year, and you get put in the pool that says you didn't hunt last year. And if you get drawn, without getting too statistical into this, if you get drawn into that sample of all the other hunters who didn't hunt or weren't successful, and all of a sudden you, as a hunter, report that you shot 200 birds this year, it blows up the statistical estimate for that stratum. Okay. And making sure that hunters get asked the questions and get put into the right box or the right stratum, the right bucket of is important. And one of the key, what we found over the 20 years of having HIP, we found that one of the key weak points is the actual clerk or third party who is selling that license and filling in that information for the hunter. The clerk may or may not ask you. As a hunter, I hope if you encounter a situation where the clerk doesn't ask you the questions, say, hey, I want to answer those questions. It's important that I answer those things. I had it happen to me as the chief of migratory bird management. I went to buy my license in Maryland at the sporting goods store that I grew up as a kid buying all my hunting stuff at. And the clerk didn't ask me the questions. I said, where are the questions? And they said, we don't do that. I said, what do you mean you don't do that? I need a HIP certification to be legal to hunt in the state. And they said, yeah, we answered them for you. And they said, no, we don't do that. We don't take the time to do that. And I said, well, I'm going to take the time to go buy my license at a different place because I want that. It's important to have those questions answered, by me, not by the sales clerk. So working with that, and then in a number of states we have of confusion when you buy a small game license or you buy a license, and their procedures are set up where sometimes you can't identify migratory bird hunters. And when I was migratory bird chief, I occasionally would get letters from people saying, I've never shot a duck in my life or, a migratory game bird in my life. I only hunt deer. Why are you asking me how many ducks I shot? And that was typically coming from some place where either the state didn't ask the questions quite right, or the licensed vendor somehow misclassified hunters. And we were, sampling deer hunters or rabbit hunters and asking them how many migratory birds that they harvested. And so, one of the things I do is sit down with states and talk to them about how they can improve their licensing to clean up the data quality. So we're sampling the right set of hunters. Adds to, better satisfaction from the hunters. You don't have to, deal with a piece of mail or a request for collecting information for that is meaningless to you. And also it improves the estimates of the number of birds and the number of migratory bird hunters that we've got. And I'm sure you and, as someone involved in, the future of hunting and knowing who our migratory bird hunters are, understand the importance of getting the right audience and talking to the right people, and designing programs that help keep them engaged and help them understand why it's important to participate. So I think all that information that we're getting from hunters can really feed the management system, and that's why it's important that we get good quality data from them, and that hunters understand why they're participating, and frankly, all the other people that are involved with it understand the value and why the data quality is important.
You did a great job of describing some of the ways that it can go wrong, and the fact that you're looking to identify those. I think one that's easy to data that you collect that's very easily comparable to what a state collects is some states you have to buy a license or a state stamp to hunt migratory birds. So the state can have their count of how many waterfowl hunters they have in their state. And now if you compare it to HIP and you go back to that question where, let's say, the license clerk clicked no, that for 20, there's a line of 20 hunters, and for the sake of time, they clicked, nope, this person is not a migratory bird hunter. They click it 20 times. Those people should have been counted as waterfowl hunters. So that's a real easy comparison of saying, okay, the HIP estimate is not going to compare with the state estimate. And so, it's pretty easy to see where some of those flaws can pop up. And I guess that's really important information to you. And you're looking to target that specific transaction and others to improve the overall data set.
Yeah, there's lots of examples of where clerks, the third party, I don't want to pick on any company or any particular, but where they'll either answer or anyone who buys a license, they'll just click HIP certification, just to go down the list, and so they don't make their job harder and asking all these questions. Do you want a deer license? Do you want a combination fishing license? Everything. They'll just click, HIP doesn't cost anything in those states. They'll just go ahead and click it. And all of a sudden you're getting all these other people that have no interest in migratory birds, who are HIP certified, and just mudding up the sampling frame. And, we have some examples, I think, that you want to talk about on some changes that we've just made cooperatively with a couple of states this past year. And we found that a lot of the previous HIP certifications were coming from basically from big game hunters. Mm-hmm. And, you want to talk about those examples now, or?
I think, are you talking about the 2-tier for? No,
I was talking about
sure,
the examples in Louisiana and Arkansas this past year. And
go ahead. Yeah.
And we changed those two states changed their sampling frame, or their HIP certification requirements this year, where hunters, when they get their license, have to get online afterwards and get the HIP certification, answer the questions directly, and not go through a clerk. And in both of those states, over 100,000 hunters disappeared from HIP certification between 2019 and 2020. And when we dug down deeper, found out that most of those hunters were registering at the beginning of their deer seasons. And so you can imagine those prior year HIP estimates, the number of waterfowl or migratory bird hunters that they had, didn't match up with the state duck stamp sales. They were off. And all of a sudden, once we've changed the procedures, those two numbers are lining up almost perfectly.
Okay. So sometimes the remedy is obvious, right?
Yes. Yeah. But there's been a lot of concern that by doing that, there was going to be it was going to make it more complex, make it more difficult for hunters to get their HIP certification, and they wouldn't do that. I don't have any evidence that it drove people off or they didn't get it. No increases in contacts from law enforcement officers or anything like that. But there was some difficulties in getting people registered if they weren't comfortable getting on the web or using the agency app, but got through most of those by frankly, in some cases, talking to the grandchildren and having the grandchildren talk grandpa through how to go and do this on their cell phone.
Yeah, it's I guess the campaign that you're going on to just shine awareness on the importance of this survey, other surveys, the technological challenges that some people face. I mean, the educational aspect of what you're doing is huge. And so, I applaud you. I thank you for leading this charge, and honestly, all of your years of service with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. That's impressive, and we all owe you a thank you, because talk with you, and I haven't talked with you that much, but it's pretty obvious that you're a passionate waterfowler. So you care about having access to that resource. And, as a hunter, you care about the management of that resource. I mean, look, you came out of retirement to do something else.
Oh, I'm still retired. I still spend a lot of days in my boat and in the marsh and following bird dogs around on the uplands too. So, but this is something I am passionate about, and something that, as a very avid waterfowl hunter or migratory bird hunter, I want to share with hunters so they understand why it's important, and how we can improve management. And I thank you, not only for an opportunity to appear on the Delta podcast, but as I said, I go back to Delta 1980, and some of my most prized memories and possessions are associated with Delta, all the way back to then to this day. And I mentioned I worked on swans. Your CEO is a swan biologist also. I go back many years with Frank Royer and Chris Nicolai. So many, and John Devney and the whole gang. So I got lots of friends in Delta, lots of experience, and I've benefited from my association with Delta for my entire professional career. And there's actually a long history of involvement in migratory bird professionals across the Fish and Wildlife Service and across the state agencies with Delta. So the impact of what you guys have done and do to the waterfowl management community can't be measured. It's immeasurable. So thank you.
Yep. Thank you, Brad. I'm going to flag the prior minute there. I'm going to flag that for all others here at Delta to listen to and appreciate that. I really do. To wrap up, it's a long web link, but on the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service website, fws.gov, you can mine your way into surveys and data, harvest surveys, and learn about the Harvest Information Program. And then on that page, so we talked about that first, but on that page, there's a couple links to get into the diary survey. You can learn more about it if you're curious after this conversation. And then there's another link to talk about the wing survey or the parts collection survey. Brad, are you okay if I direct questions your way that might result from this podcast?
Not a problem. One other web link that I'll make sure that you have is there is a page kind of buried in that, as you said, mining your way through, where there's an interactive map of waterfowl harvest, either by ducks or geese, by county across the country. And you can go and see harvest information that comes from the harvest survey, that ultimately started with HIP, by county. So you can look at Cameron Parish, Louisiana, and compare it to Stutsman County, North Dakota, or to Butte County, California, and compare waterfowl harvest, ducks or geese. And also on that page, you can look at regionally the peak of waterfowl harvest. So if you were planning a trip somewhere to go duck hunting, to go goose hunting, you can see when the peak of harvest occurs in each of those regions in each of those states. And I'll guarantee your listeners will get onto that page and you'll spend 2 or 3 hours just comparing what is the number one harvest county in the country or the state, and you'll be amazed when you start saying, okay, well, how many birds are harvested in Arkansas versus Alabama versus Idaho, and you'll have fun going and doing that and looking at some of the counties too. The ducks were being harvested in some counties that you didn't even know existed.
Yeah, thanks for flagging that. I'm sure, I think of myself. So send me that one. I think I want to spend some time on that one. But I appreciate it, Brad. Again, this podcast has a dedicated email address. So if you're listening to this or watching this and you have some questions, you can get that question to me, or I will flip it to Brad so we don't, reveal your personal email address. So that's podcast@deltawaterfowl.org. Pop that into an email. Send me your question or comment, and I'll receive it or share it with Brad. Brad, thanks a lot. You did a great job. It took a fairly complex subject and broke it down into easily digestible parts. So thank you for that. Thanks for all the work you're doing there, and appreciate your prior and current association with Delta. So thanks for your time, Brad.
Been a pleasure. Thank you.
All right. Take care.
We'll see you.